We're really fortunate here in South Florida to have a lot of great opportunities for a lot of different species, okay, and a lot of great tactics, trolling, bottom fishing, you know, drifting, it goes on and on. However, if I stop and think about what one of my absolute favorite techniques is, it's kite fishing. Really, really exciting. And I can tell you, you know, years ago, 20 years ago, I used to go out here and watch guys kite fish, and I never touched a kite. I was afraid to. I was intimidated. I said, you know what? Man, that really looks complicated. Really, really looks complicated. I see kites flying. How do they get that kite up there, you know? And I was really intimidated. And then slowly I came around because I realized that the guys that were putting the most fish in the boat were kite fishing. And I said, hey, if I want to score and if I want to increase my score, you know, I need to jump on the bandwagon here. And slowly got into it, you know, started to fly one kite with one bait off of a single kite, got that dialed in, and then went to 2 rods off of a single kite. And nowadays we fly 3 kites with 3 baits off each kite. You know, so we've really advanced to the top of the game. Now keep in mind there are a lot of different techniques and a lot of different nuances when it comes to kite fishing. It's all about the details. It's really, really detail oriented. When you're out there and you've got those kites flying and those baits are in the perfect position, God, it's just beautiful. And man, it is exciting. It's exciting because at any moment, you could get a crazy bite. That's what kite fishing is about. It's about the visual aspect. It's about being able to see every single bite. What we're going to talk a lot about here this evening is what I like to call meat fishing. Okay, I'm out there to put fish in the boat. Okay, I want to catch whatever. I want to catch that dolphin. Anybody want to catch a big dolphin like that on a kite bait? Okay, we all do. I want to catch that. I want to catch wahoo. I want to catch kingfish. I want to catch sailfish, blackfin tuna, cobia. I want to catch anything that eats my kite bait. I want to have a shot at that fish. So the way that we're rigged here tonight, we're going to talk a lot about that, is geared toward the meat fishing, okay? But certainly with some modifications, you can switch that off directly to the sail fishing. First, where do we kite fish? Okay, we fish right out here out of Hillsborough Inlet, and there are times we'll fish right out front. There are times we'll go down to Miami, times we'll go to Jupiter, or anywhere in between. All depends on the conditions, okay, and what you're targeting. Summertime, we fish a lot of meat fish tournaments where the key is king mackerel. You've got to get your king mackerel in the boat and get some accumulated weight before you start focusing on any of the other species. So we primarily look for, you know, that greener water where the king mackerel are predominant in that water, in anywhere from 75 to 200 feet. That's the primary zone. But don't limit yourself. Don't think that kite fishing is limited to fishing right on the edge, because it's not. We were out just Saturday kite fishing out in 500 feet of water. It's a great tactic out in the deep for sailfish and dolphin as well. You're not going to catch your king mackerel out there, but you'll catch your dolphin and your sailfish out there. So depends on the conditions, you know, on exactly where we're fishing and what we're looking for. For the most part, you're going to be kite fishing between 100 and 200 feet. You know, that's really out here off of our inlets. We've got reef lines that parallel the coast, and that's like the magic avenue, okay? But don't be afraid to go deeper, and don't be afraid to go shallower. There's times you'll see guys starting to drift in 50 feet of water, because sometimes those big kings are in, you know, in the shallower end of it, the shallower end of the spectrum. So there's a big avenue there, but for the most part, you're going to be traveling north or south versus traveling east like you would when you're looking for dolphin or when you're out there trolling for dolphin. Color of the water is important. That green, as I mentioned, is often going to hold your king mackerel. Nice, clean blue water. We all like that nice, clean blue water. Blackfin tuna, dolphin, sailfish, wahoo are all going to be in that nice, clean water. And of course, each species has a peak season. You know, May, June, the big blackfin tunas are around, you know, in our particular area. And I got to tell you, I love kite fishing for those blackfin tuna, especially in the afternoon. Low light conditions. We'll go out at 3, 4 and fish till it gets pitch black. Okay, and oftentimes you can barely see your kite. It's that dark, and you'll be getting blasted by big blackfins. So it really depends on the time of the year. Dolphin too, we've caught, I can't tell you how many dolphin on the kite baits on the shallower side. You know, sometimes they're in there on that edge. And of course, sailfish in there on that edge as well. So we look at watercolor, we look at the presence of bait, Do we see bait in the area? May it be flying fish? May it be little bonitas or skippies, you know, up on the surface? We look for birds, frigate birds, and other little terns and tuna chicks. All of the key signs that indicate that, hey, there could be fish here, right? Okay, if I don't see anything, if it looks like the Dead Sea, what am I doing? Okay, there's nothing there to attract me and nothing there to attract the fish. I don't think that I want to fish there. I've got to see something. And that means situational awareness, having a clear understanding as to what's happening all around me, up on the surface, up in the air, and also below the boat. I'm constantly keeping an eye on my Furuno sounder, and I want to know exactly what's happening under the boat. Additionally, I'm looking at my chart plotter because, again, we're drifting. Okay, we're covering ground, and I want to move. The faster you drift, within reason, the better. You cannot drift too fast when you're kite fishing. If you sit in one spot and there's no current and there's no wind, you're not going to have a successful day. You've got to cover ground, so you've got to have current. Preferably, we like that north current, but any current is better than no current. You want to move. Wind, we know that to effectively kite fish, you need wind, right? You can't fly a kite without wind, unless, of course, you have a helium balloon, and we're going to talk about that, and you still need some wind, even with the helium balloon. Ideally speaking, you know, a nice steady 10 to 15 knots is almost perfect. You'll be able to get your kite up in the air without a helium balloon, but that wind's got to be nice and steady. But you certainly can kite fish. You know, we've been out there where it's honking 25 plus, and you can kite fish. You need to make some modifications, but you can. And you can kite fish, like I said, even if there's no wind, as long as there's enough to get your kite up in the air with a helium balloon. So we run out the inlet, and I decide that I want to fish, we'll just say outside Boca, okay, just for the sake of argument. I run up the beach, I get out there in 150 feet, I stop, I look around, I stop the boat, I put it in neutral. Before I put any kite baits out, I'm leaving that boat in neutral, and I want to see exactly which way I'm going to drift. Okay, I'm looking right at that chart plotter on my track. I want to know, am I drifting inshore, am I drifting offshore? Am I going north or am I going south? Which way am I drifting? This way I could reposition the boat at the beginning of my drift to cover the prime territory. So I'm going to look back in my chart plotter and I can see there's a little northwest wind and I'm being pushed offshore. So you know what? I may come into 100 feet. And that's where I'm going to start my drift, in 100 feet of water, because I know that that breeze and the current, the prevalent conditions right at that moment, are going to push me offshore. Now, as I'm drifting offshore, I'm paying close attention. Every single bite, even if we miss the fish, I'm looking right at that machine. I'm going, ooh, 130, ooh, 145. And I'm keeping that in my mind. Where are we getting those bites? So if we drift from 100 to 300 feet, and all of the bites that we've had have been between 100 and 200 feet, I'm going to reposition back in 100 feet, and when I get to 200, I'm going to stop and go back. Okay, I'm going to focus all of my efforts in that area where I'm seeing the most activity and I'm getting the most bites. And every day, that's going to be different. It's going to be different based on the watercolor, the wind, the current, what you're targeting. There's so many different variables. You know, it's not as simple as just do it this way and don't do it any other way. Now, before I go any further and talk more about this kite, let me just give you a little history of kite fishing and how all of this started. Kite fishing was invented by the Polynesians, okay? And they used to grab these big leaves, they actually still do this today, these big leaves off a tree, and they fashioned a kite with a small little cord. And then they would find this one type of spider web. And you guys are probably looking at me like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Okay, follow me here for a second. This one type of spider web. And they would take all of that silk off that tree from that spider web and they would fashion a little lure. Almost looked like a little glittery worm. And they tied that clump of silk onto the end of the line. And they flew their kite up, their leaf, and they dangled that little lure that they created with no hook right on the surface. And needlefish would come by, and they've got those little teeth. You guys are all familiar with needlefish. And they would come by and chomp right on that little silk lure, and it would get stuck in their mouth. And then they would reel in the needlefish. And that's how they caught them. And that's where kite fishing originated. I always tell people, it makes much more sense to fish less lines, but have a really nice, streamlined, clean presentation than to have 12 lines and a big cluster, you know what. We've stopped the boat, okay, the guys on the flat line side, 1, 2, 3, 4 guys, whoever's on the flat line side, they're letting out their baits, couple deep, couple up on top, staggered at different distances. I'm over here and I'm about to put out my kite. The first thing that I'm gonna do, again, depending on the conditions, if there's enough wind, I don't need that helium balloon, okay? And keep in mind, there's a variety of different kites out there. There's light wind kites that are designed for 5 to 10 knots, okay, that have more surface area than this. They're a little bit larger, so they have more surface area, and the material is a little bit lighter. That's called a light wind kite. And then you have average kites like this SFE, one of my favorites, that'll fly in really anything from about 10 to 25 knots, okay? Good all-around kite. If you're only gonna get one kite, get an SFE. And you'll see these in red and green, exact same kite. No difference whatsoever. The only reason I make them in red and green is, for example, my guy up in the bow, he's green. I'm in the stern, I'm red, and we have our kites adjusted, okay, specifically for our positions. There's a lot of other manufacturers that make kites. Tigris is coming out with some new kites. You know, AFCO has a kite. But again, all around, the SFEs are the best in the business. Before we go on, there's some things that you need to know about kites before you even deploy them. This kite is built with spars. These spars are specific to this kite. You cannot replace this spar and put it on a different kite. If you break this spar, you better get a whole new set of spars. And that's also why on this kite, you'll see a number designation, okay, designating these spars to this particular kite. So keep that in mind. Be very careful with these spars. They're graphite, and if you slam it against a hatch or step on it, you're going to break it. Okay, we've all broken them. You're going to break it. So just be very careful. Also, you can see these little white hash marks right there on the spars. It's really important that these are all centered and lined up. So I'm going to adjust these spars so all of those hash marks are lined up. Everybody see that there? Okay, that's really important in order to get this kite to fly properly. Next, on the back side, or I should say the front side, we have a little bridle. Okay, and this little notch right here, this little tab is adjustable. And what this does, it determines how much wind this kite catches. So if you do not have a lot of wind, you may want to fly this kite in more of this position to where it catches more wind. If you have a lot of wind, you can fly the kite in this position. It's like a wing, very much like a wing. So this is an adjustable tab that ultimately you're going to have to get used to. If you can't get your kite up, you may have to adjust that tab so it catches more wind. This swivel right here, okay, sometimes this swivel, okay, this little barrel swivel, and this is what we connect our snap swivel to when we're flying this, will sometimes get twisted in here, kind of like that, okay, twisted. If that's twisted, your kite's going to go, you're going to get what I call the cartwheel of death, because once it starts spinning like crazy, forget it. Talk about a frustrating experience. So make sure that that swivel right there is not tangled. So before you even attempt to deploy this kite, stop and look at it, okay, and pay close attention to it. And make sure that it's not wet, because if it's wet, it won't fly right, okay? So make sure it's not wet. Make sure your bridles are nice and snug. Everything looks good before you attempt to fly this kite. If you dunk it, which you will, okay, trust me when I tell you, okay, it can become very challenging to retrieve it, because once this starts sinking below the surface, as you can imagine, the tension as you're pulling this up through the water, you'll often break spars, okay, and you just got to really be careful. A lot of times you'll see guys, they'll put floats right on these spars. They'll put little kite floats. This way, if it does dunk and fall in the water, the spars will keep it, the floats will keep it up on the surface, okay? If it does get wet, you've got to let it dry really, really good. Like I said, they will not fly when they're wet. So his question is, why are there split shots on here? Remember, we're flying multiple kites, okay? So if we do not adjust the direction that this kite flies in, what's going to happen is I let my kite up, and it's right out there, you know, we'll say a couple 100 feet in the air, 300 feet way out there, and my co-host or my fishing partner Carlos lets his kite out, and his kite goes straight up there. We're both in the same, what I like to call airspace. Our kites are now competing for airspace. They're right next to each other. All of our lines are going up, and we get into massive arguments. I'm like, get your kite out of my airspace. Okay, and we go back and forth. So we adjust our kites accordingly, and there are different ways to do that. The easiest way to do it when you are not using a helium balloon is to simply take small split shots. As you can see, there's one tabbed right there on the top, and there's one right on the bottom here. You don't need a lot. Kites are really sensitive, okay, really sensitive. Every small change that you make to that kite, every adjustment, make them in small increments. Don't go from no split shots to 6 split shots. Okay, your kite's gonna whoop right in the water. Okay, so very small adjustments. Usually, one split shot up on top and one on the bottom is enough. Now, what's gonna happen with this, if again, you can all picture this, my kite's gonna start flying in the air and it's gonna bank because of the weight of the split shots. It's gonna bank. And as it banks, it's gonna go whoop right out there. Now, the guy up in the bow, he's got split shots on his kite too, but guess where his are? On the opposite side, right? Very easy to understand. His are on the opposite side. So now his kite is banking this way, and my kite is banking this way. And we're able to have a really nice spread apart spread. If we're fishing 3 kites, the center kite has no split shot. We want that one right down the middle, okay? Right down the middle between the other 2. So again, that's also why we use the different colors. I know this is my kite, his is the green one, okay? And we bank them. That's what the split shots are for. Now, when you're using balloons, and we're gonna talk more about how to affix the balloon to the kite, but you'll notice that we don't have split shots. But what you will notice is you see how the balloon is not centered on the kite, okay? And that's because when I let this kite up, this balloon is gonna force the kite this way. You follow me? Because it's on this side of the kite, and the wind is gonna blow the kite this way, and it'll bank. It's doing exactly the same thing that the split shots are doing. But I don't need the split shots when I have a balloon on, as long as I position the balloon properly. On the opposite side, up on the bow, that balloon is going to be on this side. And remember, it's opposite. In other words, if I'm in the stern and I want my kite to go to the left, my balloon needs to be on the right side of the kite. A lot of people make the mistake and they say, well, if I want my kite to go to the left, my balloon needs to be on the left. And that's incorrect. What's happening is this helium balloon is pulling the kite up this way from the force of the helium. And in turn, again, it acts as a wing. And the breeze is going to push this kite off to, you know, it's going to have it bank to the left. When it comes to balloons, when it's borderline, when the wind is borderline and you're struggling to get a kite up in the air, I always go with the balloon. It's worth the time and effort, because once you have that balloon on there and this baby's flying high, it's going to make your entire day much, much easier. Their question is on the split shots, do you always use the same size or different sizes? And absolutely, in my kite box, I've got a variety of size split shots. Sometimes I'll add, like I said, 1 to each corner. Sometimes you could add 2 or just a larger one. So it's always a good idea to have different sizes, but not imperative, because again, if I really needed to bank more, I could always add a second split shot of the same size right to that same position. There have been times where we've had 3 or 4 split shots right here and 3 or 4 split shots right here. And on other occasions, you only need 1. Again, remember, it's going to vary tremendously depending on the conditions. And if you're only flying 1 kite, you don't need to worry about the split shots at all, because your kite will go up in the air, good to go, okay, and not a big deal at all. So if there is not enough wind, and while on the subject of the helium, of the balloons, then obviously what we do is we inflate a helium balloon, and there are 2 ways to do that. One is with a fixed helium system, like the one that we have on our 37 CV. It's pretty much like a scuba tank. okay? Just a tank, like a welding tank, holds a lot of helium. Depending on the size of the tank, you'll be able to fill anywhere from 5 to 10 balloons. You fill the helium tank at your local welding shop, and I can tell you that helium is not cheap nowadays. You know, to fill 5 balloons is going to cost you about $100 in helium, okay? Then, of course, you need the balloons, okay? And keep in mind, they're not reusable. You know, obviously, once you're done for that day, you're done for that day. And you're popping that balloon, and that's the end of that. A fixed system is nice. We've got it in one of the holes with a couple suction cups. It's got a long hose. We can move that hose around the boat, and we can inflate that balloon. Or if you don't want to invest in a fixed system, you go to Party City and you get the little disposable pink helium tanks. Costs about $40. We'll fill 2 balloons, okay? Not the best option, but better than no helium at all, okay, by all means. So those are the 2 options for filling your balloons with helium. You want the balloon, when you inflate that balloon, you want it to be approximately the exact same width as the kite. You don't want it wider or less than the kite. You're shooting for the same width as the kite. It doesn't need to be any larger or smaller. You affix the balloon, and I'm just going to let this slide up here for a second. On the back side of the kite is a little notch right there. Everybody see that little hole right there? I'll kind of try and slide out here. So you are going to use rigging floss, not fishing line, because fishing line, when you snip the end, is sharp. And the last thing that you want is to affix that balloon to the kite, and a little piece of 80-pound test goes pop, and it blows it up. You're like, oh, God, I got to do this again. So don't use fishing line. Use rigging floss. It's nice and soft. And you won't pop any balloons. Next, once you tie that balloon to the kite, and again, you can see I've tied it right to that notch, you now have to affix that balloon to the kite. This needs to be one cohesive unit. The balloon has to be affixed to the kite. There are different ways to do that. The easiest, or I don't want to say the easiest, probably the most popular way is you can take a piece of 80-pound test monofilament, tie it to this corner, wrap it around the top of the balloon, and tie it to this corner, and then put a piece of electrical tape across the top of the mono, and that will hold the balloon in place. We use something called balloon thongs, okay? Really easy. They're adjustable. You can see these slide, and it allows me to position the balloon on the kite exactly where I want it. Okay, so it's just called a simple balloon thong. It affixes right to the end of the kite. It's adjustable, makes keeping the balloon to the kite really simple. But you'll also notice that I've got electrical tape. Don't use any other tape. Electrical tape is the only tape that you should use for this application. And I put a little piece of tape over top of that thong because remember, when this is 300 feet in the air, do not be under the impression that this is just sitting there this steady. It's going, it's lit. I'm not kidding you. I know this because we put a GoPro camera on one and sent it up. And it went, and I'm like, doesn't look like it's shaking that bad. Well, it's shaking that bad, okay? And if you don't have that kite or that balloon affixed to that kite really well, you're just going to have a really frustrating experience. So make sure that you take your time, one cohesive unit, okay? And this is going to make a big, big difference on days when there's not a lot of wind. A big, big difference. What if there's no wind and I'm putting a helium balloon on my kite, but I'm only fishing one kite? I don't need it to bank. No problem. Just put the balloon right in the center of the kite. And keep in mind, the kite thong that I just pointed out to you in this particular case has 3. That comes off of 3 of the 4 corners. They sell that exact same kite thong with 4 corners. So now you can position your balloon directly in the center of the kite. If you're only fishing one kite, truthfully, even if it banks a little to the left or to the right, that's okay. That's okay. It's still out away from the boat. Lines are away from the boat. Not a big deal. But you don't have to make those fine-tune adjustments as to what direction the kite needs to fly in if you're only fishing one kite. Does that make sense to everybody? If you're fishing 3 kites, do you stagger the lengths of the kites? And the answer is not really. We definitely keep them spread way apart. So the stern kite's way out here, the bow kite's way out here, the center one is right down the middle. The guy working the kite station, if I'm working right here, my kite, I use a number on this Tanacom as a reference, and I know that at 100, Okay, my kite's where I want it to be. The guy up in the bow, he may not be using that same 100 as a number, but it's very challenging when you're down at the boat and you see your kite's way up there to go, you know, that looks like it needs to come in a little. You know, they don't have to be even, in other words. You just want them out there and spread apart. That's what's really important. His question was the tab adjustment in order to gain or reduce the amount of wind that this kite will catch. So you can see there's this little tab right there. Okay, it's just a little kind of brown tab. And that tab slides. As you pull it out away from the kite, this kite's going to catch less wind. If when you pull it in closer, it's going to catch more wind. But remember, it's very sensitive. So when you make adjustments, you will see that there's a little black tab. I don't know if you can see this, but when they sell these kites, there's a black mark right there, about 1.5 to 2 inches in front of the tab. And then there's another black mark approximately the same distance behind the tab. That's your window. That's where you're going to slide that tab. You should never go below it or above it. You won't have to. Even a 1/2 inch will make a big difference in how that kite flies. Let's talk about the kite rod itself. You know, back in the day, and still today, a lot of guys were kite fishing with manual kite reels, not an electric kite reel. They were using a manual kite reel. Does it work? Of course it does. You put it in free spool, the kite goes up. Okay, no big deal. But when you want to retrieve that kite, you got to crank that reel. And retrieving that kite through the air with all that resistance when it's blowing 20 isn't exactly so easy, okay? It really isn't that easy. And suddenly it becomes a very frustrating experience. Additionally, you can't make adjustments without physically cranking, okay? With my kite reel or with an electric kite reel, I can engage the kite reel and walk away. Okay, I don't have to worry about it, and that can bring the kite all the way back to the boat and will stop automatically. So there are huge advantages to these power assist kite reels, especially these Daiwa Tanacoms. I use a Daiwa Tanacom 1000, has a very simple little readout right there. You could also use the Daiwa Tanacom 750. You cannot use the 500 because the hole in the level wind is not large enough for the swivel. Simply plug it in, obviously, to a battery or to an outlet on the boat. It's got a variable speed, okay? You can also set where it stops so I don't have to worry about that kite, you know, literally hitting the rod tip, because the last thing that you want is this to hit this rod tip right here. You've got 3 clips there, and we're going to talk about the clips in a second, and really it could be a disaster. The line makes a big difference. 50 or 60 pound is a nice average, 50 or 60 pound line on your kite reel. But if it's really, really windy, you may want to go up to 80 pound braid on the kite reel. And then there are guys who, especially these tournament guys, when there's no wind at all, they'll go as light as 30 pound on their kite reel. Because the thinner the line, the less resistance in the wind. And I have to stress this, there are times when there's just so little wind that every little, fraction of a gram makes a difference, believe it or not. Every tiny little nuance makes a difference on if you can get that kite up in the air or not. And sometimes you have to reduce I don't want to say the tension, but the drag, from the wind, the resistance. You have to reduce everything as much as you possibly can. And again, that might mean lighter line. It might mean, smaller baits that we're going to talk about. Now, obviously, I don't expect you to go out and buy numerous electric reels and have one loaded with 30, one loaded with 50, and one loaded with 80. Okay, unreasonable for you to do that. But that's what the guys at the top of the game, that's why you see 6 of these on their boat, okay, because they know that it can make a big difference. If you only had to put one thing on here, I would go with the 50 or I'd probably say 60. Okay, go with 60 pound braid is the right all-around line, keeping in mind that you may need to make adjustments. The rod itself, small little Chaos kite rod, you can see this is not designed to be fighting fish, okay, obviously. Just a little kite rod. These come in different lengths. Some of them are this long, some of them are this long. What's important is this tip top, this little tip top here. It's not a regular top like, say, a regular guide where it could break or nick, and that's really important because there's so much tension on this kite line. When that kite is 300 feet in the air and that kite line is tight, If you have a little nick in a guide and it rubs against that braid, guess what's going to happen? Pop, premature line failure. And there goes your kite and your balloon, and you're not getting it back. Okay? You'll be lucky if you get it back. And you've got 3 lines going up to the kite. So you want to talk about a nightmare? So you don't want that to happen. So this type of guide, okay, and I just don't recall the exact name of this guide, but is the right guide on a kite rod. Some guys will tie a safety line from the kite rod to a cleat, okay, because when you have all of that tension on that kite flying up there, you're going to think, well, wait a minute, why is the rod not going flying out? That could happen. Absolutely, that could happen. If that isn't snapped into the gimbal in the rod holder, that certainly can happen. Next is the rigging. Right at the end of my kite rod, I have a small ball bearing snap swivel, a little diamond rotary 75-pound ball bearing snap swivel. This snap swivel is what connects to my kite, okay, right there to that barrel swivel. That's the first thing, the first connection. As I let my kite up, I'm going to let it up approximately 50 feet. At that point, I'm going to reach my first release. You can see I've got 3 release clips, but they're all different colors. There's a significance to that. Each hole is drilled. We'll see that the holes in these kite clips, from large to medium to medium to small. And then there are swivels that are appropriately spaced at 50 to 70 feet apart on the line. And the different holes allow release clips to slide over the swivels. That's how I can reel all the way to the rod tip. But now as I let this out, and I get my kite 50 feet in the air, the first swivel through the hole on my first, through the hole on my second clip, but then it's going to catch on the far clip. And it will not let this black far slide any further down. Everybody with me so far? 50 to 70 feet away from that is another slightly larger. And that will stop my middle clip. 50 to 70 feet away from that is another largest swivel. And that will stop my close clip. My short, as I call it. So now I have 3 release clips. I've got my kite, 50 feet apart, 50 feet apart, release clip apart, 50 feet apart, 50 feet apart, 50 feet apart, release clip. Everybody with me? Everybody with me? This release clip is adjustable. It's got a little knob on here that's adjustable how much tension it requires to open and close that release clip. Very much like an outrigger. Same thing. This is an outrigger clip. This is an outrigger clip. A little bit of a different fashion. And it's adjustable. You have to adjust it because if you have a lot of wind and you're fishing big bait, you have this release clip too light. And you let all your baits out, suddenly your goggle eye decides to go 10 feet below the surface and pops the clip. If you want to set that bait again, you've got to retrieve, bring everything back in and start over. So make sure that your release clips are adjusted appropriately. On the other hand, there are days when there's no wind and we're struggling to keep our kite aloft, even with the balloon. Okay, but we finally got it up there, but there's no wind. And a fish comes by and he grabs that bait. If that release clip is too tight, he's not going to be able to pop it open. He's literally going to pull that kite down and the release clip is not going to open. So you have to adjust those release clips based on the conditions. Now, keep one thing in mind. A lot of the tournament guys and a lot of the guys that are at the top of the kite fishing game, you will see that, I'm obviously not going to pull 50 or 100 feet of line out here, but they will take some rigging floss and they will wrap it around this main running line to prevent the release clip from sliding up. Okay, we want it to slide down, we know that, but they'll prevent it from sliding up. Why? Because sometimes when it's really windy, the wind will catch your line and it'll literally pull that clip up the line. And what happens when that clip goes up the line? Your bait comes out of the water. And you're not going to catch a fish if your goggle eye or pilchard is 8 feet in the air. Not going to happen. Okay, I promise you, it's not going to happen. So they tie, like I said, a little piece of rigging floss or something to prevent that from coming up. But again, you don't need to worry about that if you're just getting started. I've got my kite attached, and now I've got my kite 50 feet away from the boat. And this is where it really gets good. Now we're actually going to talk about getting our lines out and putting them in the release clips. So my kite is 50 feet away from the boat, approximately up in the air, and I have reached this position. The swivel is right there. It is about to carry my long release clip up. At this stage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my long bait, and we're talking about fishing, as you can see, 3 rods. My furthest bait, my long, that's what I call it, is always the reel furthest away from the kite reel. I cannot put my long bait here because I'm going to tangle with all of the other ones. So my long bait is the furthest one away from my kite reel. So I want you to imagine this for 1 second. I fished the stern spot. I've got my kite reel here to the left. I've got my long, my medium, my short. The guy up in the bow, he's fishing like this. Like this, okay? He's got his kite over here, and this is his long, and this is his medium, and this is his short, because his kite's banking to the right. My kite is banking to the left, so I'm on the opposite side. Okay, and if you are going to fly 2 kites and suddenly you need to go to that other station, remember that switcheroony that just happened there, because that could be a nightmare too. So I've come to my first release clip. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hook, and what I do is I like to just put it on my reel seat, and I do not put a bait on yet. What I'm showing you is the fastest way to set 3 baits, and I can tell you that I've timed this, and from a standstill position, I've gotten a kite up in the air and 3 baits in the water in under 3 minutes from beginning to end, okay? So on my running line, I've got a ring, a little ceramic ring, right on the running line. Somebody just asked about how do you attach your running line to the release clip. You could easily take your running line and literally just put it right on the release clip. But I don't like to do that because I don't want that sharp little edge right there potentially chafing my line, okay, and creating any wear. So what I do is I use these little black ceramic rings. That's the first thing that's on my line. And I put that ring right on the release clip. So as you can see, the line is held onto the release clip by that ring. There's no friction. It's right on the ring. I get a bite, and look what happens. Pop, and it pops right off. So that's the first thing that I do is I take that release clip, I put it on my long, I keep the clicker on the reel, and I let my kite fly. My kite is 50 feet in the air. I now put it in free spool, okay? My reel is in free spool, and I'm going to let the kite fly. And it is going to take this line with it. And I'm going to let it fly all the way up until I reach this point, my second clip. So picture this. My line is going from the rod tip all the way up to the release clip, and it's going whoop, right back to the reel. Everybody with me there? Okay, my hook is still on the reel seat. Okay, or you can put it on a guide. I like to put it on the reel seat right there. Okay, and in turn, again, if you could picture this, the float is right here because the rig is right here, but the line is going all the way up there to the release clip and coming right back down. Once I get to my second release clip, I'm going to do the exact same thing with my middle bait. I'm going to take the hook, I'm going to put it right on the reel seat, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. And now I'm going to let the kite fly all the way up to my third release clip. Once I get to my third release clip, exact same thing. Okay, I'm going to take my rig, put it right on my reel seat, clickers on, let it fly. So now I'm going to let my kite fly all the way out to where I want it, to the 100 mark, because that's where I like to fish it. So once my kite gets to the 100 mark, and keep in mind, as I'm letting it out, these reels are going zzz, all 3 of them, because as you can imagine, line is coming off of the rod tip and coming right back down to the reels. Everybody with me there? Okay, I get my kite all the way up to where I want it. I lock it up. I come back to my reels. I lock it up. I lock it up. I lock it up. And the first thing I do is just reel in the slack. Okay, if there's any slack, I'll reel in the slack. So now all 3 lines are nice and tight, coming right back here to the boat. Okay, right back to the reels. I haven't put a single bait on yet. Now I'm ready to set my baits. I run back to the bait well, I grab my goggle eye, my pilchard, whatever it is. Nothing beats a goggle eye when it comes to a kite bait, really frisky and strong. Okay, strong, and that's what's important. Okay, you put a fragile pilchard on there, and if that thing dies, you know, that's not what we want. A dead bait is not a good kite bait. So, nice goggle eye, I take them. I'll either bridle them or hook them however it is that I'm going to hook them, depending on what we're doing, if we're fishing circle hooks or J hooks. And I will take that goggle eye and I'll throw them in the water right next to the boat, and I will slowly walk that goggle eye out below the release clip. Pay close attention to what's happening and only apply as much pressure as you can, because remember, if you apply too much pressure, pop right out of the release clip and you got to start all over. So you will slowly walk that bait all the way out to where it comes right up on the surface, and then it's okay if you pull them up out of the surface and let them swing like on a pendulum, because that's what it is, right? The release clip is way out there. Pull that bait up and it's going to go whoop, right across the surface, boom, drop them right in the water, right there. That bait's set. I'm done. I move on to my next bait. I do exactly the same thing. I move on to my third bait. I do exactly the same thing. At this stage, I've walked all 3 baits out there. I'm in one position. I'm controlling my kite rod. I'm controlling my 3 baits. Okay, when I say controlling, do not be under the impression that when this baby's flying up in the air that she's just sitting in one spot, because she's not, okay? She goes down, she goes up, she goes left, she goes right, and especially if the wind is fluctuating. As that breeze fluctuates and you get a gust of wind, the kite's going to come higher up in the air. Okay, balloon or no balloon, the kite's going to come higher up in the air. When that happens, you have to let your baits down, because a bait that's 8 feet in the air is not going to catch anything. Okay, you've got to let your bait down. Do not be under the impression that your bait has to be up on the surface, freaking out like this, you know, splashing up on the surface. As a matter of fact, I don't even like that. I don't want to do that. You know why? Because that goggle eye or whatever bait is having a hard time breathing. He's not even in the water, and he's struggling like crazy because he's dangling up in the air right on the surface. No, let him go. Drop him. Let him swim 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 feet below the surface. Okay, as long as that float is not on the surface, you know, floating on the surface, you're fine. He doesn't have to be right on the surface. Okay, if he's a few feet below the surface, that's perfectly fine. So I'm constantly monitoring it. I take the clickers off, or else you'll drive everybody on the boat crazy and they'll call you a Googan. Okay, so we take the clickers off, and by sitting in one position, I can let out line, I can retrieve line, I can make these little adjustments, okay? And you have to do that. Kite fishing is not set it and forget it, okay? Rarely does that ever happen. You're lucky if you can sit back for 60 seconds without having to make an adjustment. Okay, especially when you're fishing 3. Okay, if you're fishing 1, it's not that big of a deal. If you're fishing 3, you got to stay on it. You're focused. It's like everything else. The more you put into it, the more you get out of it. So I'm constantly monitoring. I'm constantly making sure my baits are exactly where I want them. Is there any special consideration that you need for hooking the bait fish? And the answer is absolutely yes. Imagine this. You've got a bait that's dangling from the surface. If you hook him in the nose, he's going to dangle like this. Right? Is that going to look like a natural bait? No. You've got to hook that bait right in the back so it swims horizontally in a natural position. So again, if we're specifically sail fishing with circle hooks, with these wonderful coastal black VMC circle hooks that are the absolute world's best, that I gave everybody some, okay? And there are no better hooks in the entire world. Then you would want to bridle that circle hook to the bait with a rubber band or a piece of rigging floss, because you want that circle hook fully exposed. If you're fishing J hooks, if you're meat fishing, remember we talked about that earlier today, you know, in the beginning when I said I'm after everything, I'm fishing a J hook. So what I'll do for simplicity and speed, I'll take that goggle eye or the pilchard and right below the spine. Make sure that you don't sever that spine. You sever his spine and bury that hook in him, adios goggle eye. Okay, so just right below the spine. I don't like offset hooks. This is a VMC O'Shaughnessy short shank live bait hook. I don't like the offset hooks when I'm kite fishing because they tend to turn back into the bait. You guys know what I mean? You know, if that shank is bent, it turns back into the bait. So I like the straight hook. when I'm kite fishing. I want to keep that hook fully exposed. It's, literally just right below the spine, right in the middle of the bait or right by its dorsal fin where it's swimming horizontally in a nice natural fashion. When it comes to hooks, while we're on the subject, again, if you're specifically sail fishing, listen, sailfish are worth much more alive than they are dead. Okay, great species, great game fish. You don't want to hurt them. A circle hook is the way to go. It's deadly effective. If you're not already using circle hooks in a lot of different applications, like I said earlier, you're missing the boat. They're really, really cool, and you don't have to do anything. Okay, just let the fish eat the bait. When the line comes tight, start reeling. Okay, and you got them. They'll hook them in the corner of the mouth every time, or at least 98% of the time. But that circle hook needs to be fully exposed. Sailfish tournaments require non-offset circle hooks, the ones that I gave everybody. They're not offset, so it's not going to get that fish deep down in its gut. It's going to get them in the corner of the mouth. It's not a stainless hook, okay, because we know that stainless steel isn't going to rust out and that fish could eventually perish. So non-stainless, non-offset circle hooks are tournament approved when it comes to sail fishing, and a requirement. You cannot fish J hooks. However, if I'm going out there meat fishing and I'm looking for kingfish, dolphin, wahoo, blackfin, cobia, and everything else that could potentially eat my bait, I'm fishing a J hook. I'm also fishing a very short piece of wire. I'm fishing 12 inches of wire, okay? You will still catch the tuna, you will still catch the sailfish, you'll still catch the dolphin with a little bit of wire. So I don't fish a lot of it. You can fish a lot because remember, your bait is dangling in the water. And a lot of people say, well, they don't see the wire. Well, the truth is they do see the wire because the bait, like I said earlier, is not right on the surface. I'm letting them swim a little bit below the surface, right? So this wire could be in the water. But I find a nice happy median, and that's 40-pound. Single strand, 40-pound wire. Okay, I don't use the number 6 or the number 7, the heavy stuff. I stick with the 40-pound. It's a balance. It's really light. It's flexible. The bait has plenty of movement, natural movement, but it gives me a little bit of insurance against toothy critters. Okay, I used to fish titanium. Okay, really cool stuff. Really expensive and a pain in the butt when it comes to knots and little crimps and all that kind of stuff. I did that for a couple of years, and then I went back to the single strand. And I said, you know what? This stuff works just as good. We're getting just as many bites, bridle or no bridle. Remember what we talked about earlier. If we're sail fishing with circle hooks, yes, bridle, okay, because we want that circle hook fully exposed in order for it to do its job. If we're fishing with a J hook, I don't bridle a J hook. You can, but I don't. I just bury it, like I said, right under the spine. Stinger rigs. What's a stinger rig? A little piece of wire coming off of here, 6 inches with a little treble hook. Okay, often used when you're targeting king mackerel. I don't like stinger rigs. I used to fish them. To me, you know what? If I'm going to get a good bite on a nice king, sail, dolphin, tuna, I don't need that stinger rig to hook them and to stay glued. So you can use a stinger rig. I don't find it to be that effective. My leader, while we're on the subject, your leader, remember that once my baits are set and they're way out there away from the boat, I'm looking at my float. Okay, my float's right here. I want my leader to be long enough to where my float is over the horizon. Otherwise, I'm not going to see it against the water. Okay, especially when it's sunny and I've got a glare. Even with my awesome Salt Life optic sunglasses cutting that glare, I'm still going to lose that float. So I've got to have a leader that's long enough for my float to be above the horizon, 12 feet at a minimum. Okay, 12 feet is a good length, 12 to 15 feet. That's the leader below the float right to the hook. So as you can imagine, this bait, just imagine with me, is down here, is right on the surface, and look where my float is. It's way up there. So I could see it over the horizon. Now you'll also notice on my 3 rods, I have 3 different color floats. Okay, so I know that my long is green, my mid is yellow, my short is pink. On the subject of floats, not all floats are created equal. There are a lot of different types of floats for various, applications. This is your typical kite fishing float right here. This is what you'll see the most of. It's small and streamlined, very light, catches very little wind. Really important. You don't want that wind to catch that float and blow that bait out of the water. So this is the most affordable and the most commonly used float. Here's a different size, much larger, but it has an internal weight inside it, much heavier. So if it's really windy, if I use this float, my bait may not be in the water. The wind may be pushing my bait and pulling it up the line, and I might be having a hard time keeping that bait in the water. I might have to switch to a larger float that has an internal weight. Of course, I could add my own weight. You can see exactly how I have this rigged. I've got typical green size float, and then you can see I've got a little weight right below it, right there, just a tiny little weight to help keep that line vertical in the water. But again, these come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. Okay, you could even use streamer, okay, to see your lines out there. You don't have to use different colors, but that makes it easier. And now I'm going to tell you a little trick here that we use sometimes that's really cool, but it's going to require you to really be dialed in. So when we're rigged like this with our floats and our long leaders, this is a great presentation, works really easily, but there's only one problem. When I'm fighting that fish, may it be a sailfish, tuna, blackfin, whatever it is, once that float's right there, guess what? I can't reel anymore. And my fish is still 12 to 15 feet away from the boat. So either I've got to step back, and the gaff guy can get in there and stick a gaff in it, or grab the leader to release the fish. It could become problematic. Not a huge ordeal, it's something that we're used to, and this is the standard in the industry doing it this way. However, you do not need floats to kite fish. You do not need all of this fancy schmancy stuff to kite fish. There are times, especially when there's not a lot of wind, we'll eliminate all of this. All of it, completely. Just get rid of it. And I'll tie my main running line to 6 feet of leader material, okay, with a blood knot or a uni to uni with no swivels, nothing. Now I'm going directly up to my kite, all the way back down to my rod with none of this fancy schmancy stuff. And I'm going right to the bait. And I can let my kites out. I can let my baits out. It doesn't matter to me if that goggle eye is 3 feet below the surface or 10 feet below the surface, as long as he's in the water. And I'm going to know he's in the water because I'm looking out there. I don't need to look at the float. I don't see a goggle eye flying through the air, okay? And I could see my line going down into the water. I'm good, just like that. So there are times we will fish with no floats at all and just fish 3 lines going up and right down into the water. Really cool tactic. It makes setting your baits even faster, okay, really quickly. You can fight that fish right to the rod tip. You don't have to worry about the float hitting the rod tip, but you've got to be dialed in. You got to know what's happening here, okay? If you're not sure what's happening, that's not the right way to start, okay? This is the right way to start, and you can advance to that level. That's also where line color comes into play. High vis. This is diamond line, 20-pound diamond line. 600 yards on this reel. It's high vis. Why do I want high vis? Because I want to be able to see it. I wear glasses, clearly, and it's hard for me to see. And if I use a clear line, I'd be like, where is it? I can't see it. Okay, and really it becomes challenging because you're talking about baits that are way out there. So the high vis line reflects the sun, and it really makes it really easy to see. It's high vis above the surface, but I don't have to worry about it below the surface because I've got a clear fluorocarbon leader that the fish can barely see. So I've got low visibility below the surface and high visibility above the surface. We're drifting along, everything looks good. I'm just waiting for a bite, baby, because I know it's coming. Okay, and suddenly I see my middle bait flipping out, and boom, big splash right on that middle bait. Or a sailfish grabs it or something. How do I know I'm getting a bite? Trust me, there's no doubt. You're going to know you're getting a bite. Okay, and it pops out of the release clip. Now I grab my rod, and I've got to reel like crazy because I've got a lot of line that went up to the release clip and back down into the water, especially on my long, right? All right, that's way out there. So that's why I fish these Daiwa Saltiga 50s hyper speeds, 7.1 to 1, super fast reel. Okay, so I can gain all of that line. This thing is blistering fast. Okay, I can gain all of that line back and come tight and bury that hook in that fish. Okay, can you use braid on here? Absolutely, you can. There's guys that are fishing with braid. I don't like to in this application. I don't feel that you need, here's what's really cool about braid. No stretch, really sensitive. Great for bottom fishing, okay? Great where there's a lot of structure, you know, inshore fishing. But when I'm kite fishing, I don't need that sensitivity. I don't need to feel the bite. I see the bite. So I don't need the extra sensitivity on my kite reel. Plus, I got to be honest, I really don't recommend it because mono is easy to work with. Okay, it's really easy to work with. If you have these 3 reels loaded with braid and this loaded with braid, and your kite suddenly has a mind of its own and decides to go into a cartwheel of death and just starts spinning at 900 revolutions a minute and decides to go poof right in the water, and now you've got 4 braided lines going out there with baits going like this, okay, and guess which way the boat's going? Not that way. It's going this way on top of everything. You want to talk about a nightmare? Okay, that's going to put you out of business for a couple hours. The mono is really easy to work with. It really is, and that's what I would recommend. Keep in mind, I said to you, 20-pound diamond line. Nice balance right there. Remember what I said earlier? I like to reduce my signature. I want that line to be as thin as possible because I don't want that wind to catch it. If I was fishing 50-pound on here, it would be way too heavy. Too much resistance against the wind. Plus, I wouldn't be able to have enough line capacity on my reel. Speaking of which, just real quick back to the braid. Not a bad idea to have the bottom of the reel loaded with braid and a top 100 yards or 200 yards of mono. You certainly can go in that direction and use braid as backing. The rods, Chaos, composite rods rated for 15 to 30 pound lines, 7-foot rods. I use this particular rod for everything. I use these rods bottom fishing, trolling, we'll do all sorts of stuff with it. It's a great versatile rod and a perfect kite rod. It's got plenty of backbone, all that you need. Affordable, durable, will last you forever. I fished the Daiwa Saltiga 50s. There's a lot of other reels on the market that are just as good. There's guys that fish Accurates. There's guys that fish Penns, Shimano's, you know, Avits, you know, there's all sorts of good stuff out there. Whatever you have, use it, okay? And if you're gonna go out and specifically buy rods and reels for kite fishing, look for high speed. Okay, because that's going to make a big difference. Look for line capacity. You're going to need it. Don't worry about a 2-speed reel. Okay, you don't need that low gear when you're kite fishing. Again, we're out there, we're kite fishing. We got a bite on our middle bait. I grab the rod, I'm reeling tight, but now I still have 2 other baits out there. And remember that where there's 1 fish, there's usually 2 fish. Okay, and I want to turn that 1 bite into a 2nd bite. So I'll try and stand there and fight that fish and still keep an eye on my other 2 rods and make adjustments. You got to multitask, people. You're fishing 3 rods. Okay, 3 rods by yourself, and the guy up in the bow fishing his kite, I can ask him to back me up, but he's focused on his baits too. So you got to work together as a team. You get a bite, come tight, lock up, boom, enjoy the fight, catch that fish. His question is, how many pounds of drag do you set your reel to? My answer to that is, I don't know. Okay, in other words, I'm not one of those guys that walks around with a scale, okay, and goes, hey, pull that to 7 pounds or pull that to 9 pounds. I don't. What I do is I'm constantly adjusting my drag because remember, as I'm moving this lever, my drag is getting lighter, stronger. You're making adjustments to it all day. I'm one of those people that after every single bait that I put out there, the first thing I do is go and I feel it, okay? Every single bait. And then even throughout as I'm fishing, I'm constantly making adjustments to my drag. I might go a little tighter, I might go a little looser. Really depends on the line, of course, the leader, what we're targeting, but I'm not one of those guys that uses a scale. If you asked me, how many pounds of drag this is, I would say it's enough. You have to know the limits of your tackle, right? You have to know how much pressure you can apply on this rod and reel and on this line before it fails. That's why, we've been fishing the same equipment for years. You get to know it intimately. Intimately, you get to know your gear. That's also why it's imperative. This rod and reel, I've got 18 of them. 18 combos that are identical. And I'll tell you why they're identical. Because no matter where you are on the boat, I can grab the flat side, I can grab those kite baits. It's consistent. I know what my rod and reel can do. I know what the line can do. I know how to control that reel. I know how to set that drag. It's consistent. Imagine if you were fishing 8 different rods and reels. Literally different reels, different sizes, different brands, different rods with different actions, right? It's really hard to get dialed into that entire system when everything is different. For me, it's about consistency. It's about, you know, all of the little differences that all add up together to make a big difference. And fishing the same rods and reels is one of those big factors. That's why all of the tournament teams and all of the best guys that are out there, you ever look at their boat and you see 20 of the same rods and reels? Okay, they buy them in sets. They don't come into Marshall and go, Marshall, I want 2 rods. They go, Marshall, I want 16 rods. And Marshall goes, sure, I'll help you. Okay? So, you know, that's why. It's the consistency factor. And it's the same everywhere. When we're trolling offshore, you know, we'll use those same rods, et cetera, et cetera. So really important there. Excellent question. Again, does the angle make a difference? You know, rod holders are not all the same. You have 0-degree rod holders, you have 15-degree rod holders, and you have 30-degree rod holders. 15-degree I like the best. Works perfect. Why? Because it puts the reel right where you want it. One thing I didn't touch on that I'd like to just talk about a little bit more. So when we're rigging this, obviously the first thing we're going to put on is our little black ceramic ring, right? Because this is what attaches to the release clip, this little black ceramic ring. The next thing that we slide on our line is the float, okay? Right there, we slide that on. The next thing that we slide on is our sinker, if we're going to add a weight. You don't have to. You have to adjust based on the conditions. If there's a lot of wind and you're having a hard time keeping your baits in the water, add weight. Okay, if there's no wind and you're having a hard time getting that kite up and keeping your baits aloft, reduce your signature by as much as you possibly can. Get rid of the weight, maybe go to smaller floats, maybe get rid of the floats altogether, okay? But then in between the sinker, if you are going to use that, we add a bead, a little red bead right there. It doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be red. You can use pink if you want. But there has to be a bead because we don't want that sinker damaging the knot on the swivel. Okay, we don't want that sinker bouncing up and down on that knot because it's going to bounce up and down all day long. Okay, so we add a little bead. Really, really simple. One of the most important elements to kite fishing is the bait. We always try and go out with 2 different kind of baits, goggle eyes and pilchards for the most part. That's what we primarily fish here. With the goggle eyes, you can go out and catch them yourself, or you can buy them at a measly $80 a dozen, okay? Keep in mind, typical tournament day, it's not uncommon for us, or let me rephrase that, if we're on a meat fishing tournament, we will not fish that tournament without 10 dozen goggle eyes, okay? We use a lot of bait. That's in addition to the pilchards. Why? Because depending on the conditions that you face out there, you may not be able to get 3 goggle eyes flying. You may have to use the pilchards if you don't have a lot of wind. You know, May, June, July, when we're fishing these meat fish tournaments, if you got a bimini start at 7 o'clock in the morning, you got 150 boats running in all different directions, and there's not a breath of wind. Literally nothing. You know, when you start fishing that morning, there's nothing. And you have to fish the pilchards. You know, you really do in order to get that presentation. Even with the balloon, you can't keep the goggle eyes. You know, you can't suspend 3 heavy goggle eyes because think about how strong those goggle eyes are. They pull that kite down when they're swimming in the water. So we always try and have 2 different kinds of bait. By the afternoon, you get the sea breeze and it's blowing, you know, southeast at 15 to 20. You can't fish the pilchards because they're too light. You have to fish the goggle eyes. So it's always a good idea to have 2 different kinds of bait. But if you can only have one, pick the goggle eye because it's very hardy, very strong, okay? And it will survive out there, you know? And don't think you're only using it once. We'll use our baits multiple times. You know, if it's out there, you bring it back in and it's still alive and good, poof, off the hook in the bait well, okay? And use it again. Okay, as long as he's alive and swimming, you can use him over and over. Just make sure you don't bury that hook in the same hole that you have it in the back. Just move it forward or back a little bit. The pilchards, not so much. Pilchards, 1-shot deal. Okay, 1 shot. You're using them, you reel it in, you take it off the hook, he's gone, he's done. You're not using them again by any means, okay? Sometimes the fish will be keyed in on the pilchards and you'll get all your bites on the pilchards and none on the gogs and vice versa. So it's always a good idea to have a couple of different kinds of bait. Ballyhoo, you can fish ballyhoo off your kite baits. You can fish blue runners. You can fish yellowtail snapper off your kite bait if you wanted to, okay? But again, obviously that doesn't make sense. What makes the most sense is the goggle eyes and the pilchards. You know, Carlos, who fishes my bow kite, he likes the pilchards and he likes mixing it up. He always puts a pilchard close to the boat, then maybe a pilchard in the middle position and a goggle eye on the long bait. Me, if there's goggle eyes on the boat and there's enough wind, I'm fishing gogs. That's it. To me, it's all about the gogs, because I look at it like this guy has to exert a lot of energy to chase and eat a bait. The reward has to be worth the risk and has to be worth the effort. I want him to look at that goggle eye and go, yeah, baby, I'm coming, big prime rib. Okay, I don't want him to look at it and go, you know, it's just a little crumb, you know, and it's not worth it. So I like to fish the bigger baits. And keep in mind, even a small little peanut dolphin will shove a goggle eye down its throat. Okay, these things are crazy. They'll eat something almost as big as them, right? We know that. So don't be afraid to fish a big bait. Don't think it's too big. It's not too big, as long as the conditions allow you to fish it. You'll often hear people telling you, don't touch the bait with your hand. You know, don't touch the bait. I can't stress that enough. Obviously, when you're taking a bait out of the bait pen with a bait net, okay, look in the bait pen, decide what bait you want, reach the net in there and scoop it out. Don't stick the net in the bait pen and start going like this. Okay, no, I don't want him, and beating up all of the other baits. You don't want to do that, okay? Pick the bait you want, scoop them out, grab the bait real quickly, hook them, throw them out there. But any bait that you touch will die. That bait will die. Any bait that you touch, you can take a live goggle eye out of a bait pen, you can hold them in your hand just like this for 5 seconds. You put them back in the bait pen, or back in the bait well. You get back to your dock, you put all your baits back in the bait pen, you wake up tomorrow morning and one of them has a big pink eye, okay, and a big scar on its back and it's swimming sideways. Guess which one that is? That's the one you touched, okay? It's like road rash. Literally, you're wiping that slime off of that bait fish. So try not to touch the baits, especially if you're storing them in a bait pen at your dock or at a buddy's dock. You know, try not to touch them. If you're keeping goggle eyes or pilchards in a bait pen, you can keep them alive for weeks or months as long as you feed them. You can feed them chum, you can feed them krill, you can feed them just scraps. They'll eat, trust me. They won't eat the day you put them in the bait pen because they need to get acclimated, okay? But give them a week. Those suckers will eat. Okay, I promise you, they'll eat. Another thing to keep in mind, sea anchors. A sea anchor will help you slow your drift. You know, a drift sock. What's a sea anchor? It's like a parachute. You throw it in the water and it slows you down. Not only does it slow you down, but it'll help keep your boat, you know, at the angle that you want it, so you could easily fish multiple kites and easily fish multiple flat lines. Do we use sea anchors all of the time? No, but we certainly have one on board the CV and we use it whenever we need to. Structure is really important. Obviously, structure attracts bait and it attracts game fish, may it be wrecks, may it be reefs, but when you're drifting, you're covering ground, okay? So you may not always be on top of that structure, that particular type of structure, but there's a lot of different types of structure. There's rips, there's color changes, there's burrs, there's debris, there's weed lines, there's all sorts of structure. You know, I even consider turtles structure because it's life, you know, it really is. So definitely focus on structure, but it depends as to what that is. There are times you're drifting along, you're kite fishing, and here comes a weed line, scattered weed, and suddenly your goggle eye is tangled in weed. Right? And, you know, you can see there's a big clump of weed right on your bait. And you're like, oh, man, I got to reel everything up. Don't reel everything up. Just reel your bait up 20, 30 feet and pop it into free spool. And just let that bait fall. And when he hits the water and splashes, the grass will come right off of him. Sometimes it happens on the first shot. Sometimes you got to do it 28 times, okay, in order to get the grass to come off of him. And even after the 28th time, you're like, well, it's just not working. It's tangled on there, you know. But don't think that you have to reel everything in. You know, kite fishing, it's a science. There's a lot of details, a lot of stuff that we talked about, but don't be intimidated by it. Listen, if I could do it, you 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 could do it. I put my pants on one leg at a time, just like everybody else in this room. You got to start somewhere, okay? If you've never done it, get the right gear, Get yourself set up with one kite, fish one bait. Go out there. It's really rewarding. You know what's really cool? It's not even about, I got to be honest, yeah, it's about catching fish and all of that excitement, but it's about the technique. It's about going out and doing something that's really innovative, that's really techie, and that requires, you know, skill and effort, and for it all to come together. When it does, it's awesome. It's so exciting, you know, to see these kites up here and your baits in the water. You know, I had an experience I'll never forget. Earlier in the spring, went out in the afternoon one day by myself on my boat. I fish alone quite often, not because I don't have any friends, it's because I like fishing alone every now and then, okay? And went out there, conditions were just perfect. Had a kite up with 3 baits, had one flat line behind me. I said, I'm put up another kite. Ran up to the bow, put up a second kite, and I'm fishing 2 kites with 3 baits off of each, okay, and a flat line. And it was just perfect because the wind was perfectly steady. The baits were not coming up and down. You know, once you had them set, it was just a matter of waiting for a bite. It was one of those really ideal scenarios that rarely happens, okay? Another thing, you really want to turn on the kite bite, live chum. Okay, live chum, load your live wells with pilchards, even the small pilchards. Get your kite baits up and just start live chumming. And don't think that you got to throw thousands of live baits. You don't. Throw a handful at a time, 3 to 5. 3 to 5 baits every couple of minutes, 3 to 5 baits, 3 to 5 baits. Because guess what all those baits are doing? You think they go, whoo. They're not going, whoo. They're going, whoop, right under the boat. Because they see this giant shadow and they're going, safety. Okay, structure, I can hide right here. If I go out there, I'm dead meat. A bonita, blackfin, something's going to eat me if I go out there. So they hide under the boat, and you have this big bait ball that just keeps building and building and building as you keep throwing baits. That bait ball gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it attracts attention, and it can turn into a really awesome experience. You know, one of probably the most exciting things, sailfish. A sailfish sometimes will come up on a goggle eye. He'll raise his sail, and all you see is this beautiful sail just circling right around your goggle eye. And you're like, yeah, baby, it's on. Okay, and he's just circling and circling and circling, and you know he's about to eat. He's going to eat it. Okay, 9 out of 10 times he eats it. But just watching that all unfold, it's like nature, you know. It's really just an incredible experience. And you know, certainly you've got to be passionate about it. If you're not sure if I am, okay? You've got to really be passionate about it because that's what it takes to do it really, really well. And if you go out there the first time and your kite goes into the cartwheel of death and it goes in the water and you get all frustrated, don't give up. Don't give up. If everybody else is doing it, you can do it too. It just takes practice, practice, practice. And there's only one way to get that practice. Go. Okay, get out there, do it. That's, you know, spend time on the water. You know, I often tell people, if you're trying to learn a tactic, like kite fishing, if you're trying to learn kite fishing, don't worry about the fish. Who cares about the fish? Invest some time in learning how to kite fish. Go out there on a day where there's a steady breeze, go right out the inlet, don't burn any fuel, get out to 200 feet, stop the boat. Who cares what's around? Get your kite up. Work on getting the kite up. Work on understanding the fundamentals of how you make these little adjustments. Get dialed in, okay? This way, when you are ready to go out there, you know, and really focus on the fish, you're ready to do so. You know, go out there and fish, but don't worry if you catch anything or not. Worry more about getting the practice and perfecting the technique.